Have you ever felt like the world's just getting a bit more cynical?
It does feel that way sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah. The material we've gathered for you today really digs into this very idea, cynicism, what it is, why it seems to be, popping up more and more.
And crucially, whether there's any light at the end of the tunnel,
Ah,
any hope.
exactly. And this isn't just about, like, pointing fingers at the office pessimist.
No, no. We're looking at how this way of thinking can be surprisingly widespread, how it affects all of us.
Even if you wouldn't call yourself a cynic outright. Okay, let's jump straight into something that might make you raise an eyebrow.
Oh, what's that?
This idea that cynics are somehow the smart ones.
Ah, yes. The cynicism equals cleverness myth.
Well, the research actually suggests the opposite. It seems cynical folks tend to score lower on cognitive tests.
And they're actually worse at spotting a fib. Worse than people with a more trusting outlook.
It really makes you rethink that whole I see through everything attitude, doesn't it?
It certainly does. What's fascinating here is that the very act of being constantly suspicious, that belief that you're seeing through everyone else's supposed ulterior motives,
Yeah.
it actually clouds your judgment. You get so fixated on potential negative outcomes
Yeah.
that you miss what's right in front of you.
Exactly. And to really get a handle on this, we've pulled together a diverse bunch of stuff, studies from psychology, sociology, economics.
And some really eye-opening personal stories, too.
Yeah. Our goal for you today is basically to give you a clearer picture of how cynicism impacts us and maybe explore some paths towards a more hopeful but still, clear-eyed perspective.
All without getting bogged down in, like, super academic jargon.
Right. So let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
When you talk about cynicism, what exactly are we talking about?
That's the essential first question, isn't it? It's important to understand that cynicism isn't just that cartoonish image of the sneering, negative person.
Oh.
It exists on a spectrum. In fact, the form most of us encounter, and maybe even recognize in ourselves sometimes, is what's known as small-sing cynicism.
Small seam cynicism. I like that. So how do we recognize this more everyday kind?
Well, one revealing way comes from a test developed way back in the 1950s, Cook and Medley.
50s. Wow.
Yeah, originally it was designed to spot teachers who might struggle to connect with students. But interestingly, it accidentally turned out to be a pretty good way to detect underlying cynicism.
Huh. So what did it involve?
It included statements like, "No one cares much what happens to you." Oof. Or, "Most people dislike helping others."
Right.
And, "Most people are honest chiefly through fear of getting caught."
Wow, those are pretty bleak statements when you think about them. So if you find yourself kind of nodding along to those.
That's a sign, yeah, a sign of a more cynical way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that even, like, minor agreements with these negative ideas can flag a broader cynical outlook.
And that shapes your interactions, presumably.
Precisely. The more someone agrees with these kinds of statements, the more likely they are to be suspicious, not just of strangers, but also people they know.
Even friends and family.
Yes. It fundamentally affects how they trust in their relationships and how they navigate, well, everything socially.
It really boils down to this fundamental assumption about what drives people, doesn't it? Now, we touched on that idea earlier that cynicism is somehow clever. Let's dig into why that's actually a drawback.
Yes, that unfortunate perception
Yeah.
that a cynical viewpoint is the mark of a sharp mind, and the opposite is being, a gullible fool.
Right.
It leads many to believe that suspicion equals intelligence, or a more realistic grasp of how the world really works.
But the research says.
The research clearly shows no. Cynics don't perform better on cognitive tasks, and surprisingly, they're actually worse at identifying lies than individuals who tend to be more trusting.
That feels completely backwards, doesn't it? You'd naturally assume being on guard would make you a better judge.
But here's where it gets really interesting. When you operate on the assumption that everyone's trying to, pull a fast one or is only looking out for themselves,
Yeah.
you don't necessarily put in the effort to truly understand people's motivations or the subtle details. It's almost like the cynicism itself acts as a mental shortcut.
A preconceived notion that stops you digging deeper.
Exactly. As we learned from the material, while naive people might blindly accept things, cynics blindly mistrust.
So mistrust can be just as much of a barrier to seeing clearly as blind trust. That's a really powerful takeaway. And how does this inherent cynicism play out when we look at something like trust itself? I recall reading about a trust game. in our sources?
Ah, yes, the trust game, a classic way to illustrate
The
this.
core insight there seems to be that cynicism, which you'd think protects you.
Paradoxically limits your potential for positive returns, right?
And
Acceleration.
how does the game work?
Okay, so people get some money. They can invest a portion with another person, the trustee. Whatever they invest is typically multiplied, say, tripled. Then the trustee decides how much, if any, to give back.
Right. So people who aren't cynical.
They tend to invest more.
Yeah.
They figure the trustee will probably return some of the increased amount.
And cynics.
They tend to invest less. They're suspicious the trustee will just keep it all.
And what actually happens? What do the trustees usually do?
Well, what's fascinating is that, on average, trustees tend to be pretty trustworthy. They return money around 80% of the time.
80%. So the cynics.
While they feel like they're protecting themselves by being stingy, they actually end up with less money overall, compared to those more willing to extend trust.
So their cynicism, intended as a shield, becomes a barrier.
Exactly. A barrier to potential benefits and positive interactions. It sounds like a self-defeating mindset in action.
Definitely. Now, let's shift gears a little bit. Our sources also explore how larger societal factors can contribute to rising cynicism. The COVID-19 pandemic seems like a really strong example of this.
It really was. So we see how individual cynicism operates. But you're right, how do larger events and structures shape these broader levels? COVID provides a compelling case study.
How so?
Well, the pandemic really shone a light on existing levels of trust in institutions. In many countries, like the US and the UK, we saw a noticeable drop in people's faith in their governments.
But that wasn't everywhere, right?
No, South Korea offers a really interesting comparison. Their government's approach was built on transparency, democracy, and openness.
What did that look like practically?
They invested heavily in testing, kept citizens informed about what they knew, and maybe more importantly, what they didn't know.
And how did that affect trust levels there?
It fostered significant trust, which meant citizens were much more willing to follow public health guidelines, voluntarily isolating, getting vaccinated.
So trust led to better public health outcomes.
Absolutely. By late 2021, their vaccination rates were much higher than in the US and UK. As South Korea's Prime Minister Chun Si-kyun put it, once you have the trust of the people, it is possible to have a high rate of vaccination. And conversely, research indicated that in countries with lower trust, vaccination rates were lower. More infections, more deaths. One analysis even suggested, get this,
What?
if every country had enjoyed South Korea's level of trust, maybe 40% of global infections could have been prevented.
40%. That's a mind-blowing statistic. It really shows the tangible, real-world consequences of trust versus cynicism at a societal level.
Here it goes.
And beyond these big crises, our sources also highlight the impact of inequality on eroding trust.
This is a really crucial point. Growing economic inequality.
Hmm.
It has a damaging effect on the social fabric.
Ow!
In regions and nations with greater inequality, you tend to see more division, hostility, stress, loneliness, materialism, and, crucially, mistrust.
And that's not just among the poor.
No, it affects the wealthy, too. Inequality can breed this kind of zero-sum mentality. The feeling that one person's gain must be someone else's loss. Makes everyone feel more on edge, less trusting.
That makes perfect sense. If the pie seems to be shrinking for some while growing for others, it's hard to feel like you're all in it together.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there are those times when trust is just flat out betrayed by people in power, what our sources call elite abuses. Partygate in the UK comes to mind.
Indeed. When influential figures violate the trust placed in them, it can have a rapid and massive impact on public cynicism.
Like with Partygate.
In that case, yeah. When those social gatherings during strict COVID lockdowns were revealed, the percentage of UK citizens feeling politicians were only out for themselves jumped dramatically, like a 9-point increase in a short time.
9 points. That's huge.
It is. Previous increases like that had taken decades. It shows how quickly trust can be shattered by perceived hypocrisy and betrayal.
And the fallout from this eroded trust can be far-reaching, leading to what our sources describe as pre-disappointment. Can you unpack that a bit?
Pre-disappointment is basically the expectation that people, particularly those in authority, will act against your interests or treat you unfairly.
Okay.
And this can be particularly damaging for individuals and communities with a history of marginalization, often along lines of class, race, ethnicity.
Like the example from Milwaukee.
Exactly. The drop in 911 calls in black neighborhoods after an incident of police brutality against an unarmed black man. The community's pre-existing mistrust was amplified, leading to reluctance to seek help even in emergencies.
That's a devastating consequence. How deeply mistrust can impact even basic safety needs.
It's chilling, isn't it?
And this pre-disappointment can also have significant health implications, right? Like with vaccine hesitancy in Oakland's Fruitvale neighborhood.
Exactly. In Fruitvale, a predominantly immigrant community, hesitancy wasn't just about misinformation. There were deep-rooted reasons for mistrust.
Stemming from
A history of poorer health care for Black and brown patients, fears about immigration enforcement, especially given the political climate. The concern was that vaccine appointments could be used for immigration raids.
So that pre-disappointment became a huge obstacle.
A significant obstacle to vaccination efforts in a vulnerable community. Yes.
It's becoming really clear how much societal structures and events can shape our levels of cynicism. Now, let's turn our attention to another really powerful influence: the media and our own negativity bias.
This is a really critical piece of the puzzle. For one thing, markets driven by self-interest can unintentionally make it easier to see self-interest everywhere.
How so?
Well, when more and more of life becomes transactional, it can kind of erode our perception of altruism and community bonds. If you're constantly seeing interactions framed in terms of exchange and benefit, it can become harder to believe in genuinely selfless acts.
And then you layer social media on top of that,
Yeah.
which seems to have its own way of amplifying cynicism.
Oh, absolutely. Social media can be fertile ground for cynicism. You get echo chambers where you only see stuff that confirms what you already think.
Right.
And the algorithms often prioritize content that triggers strong emotions, which unfortunately tends to be negative content. This constant barrage of negativity can really skew our perception of the world, make us more cynical.
And traditional news media also plays a role here, particularly with this concept of negativity bias that the research talks about.
Yes, negativity bias.
Yeah.
It's a well-established psychological thing where we just naturally pay more attention to negative information. We give it more weight.
And news organizations.
Competing for attention, they can inadvertently cater to this bias by emphasizing negative stories. The Gallup poll data on crime perception is a striking example.
What did that show?
For decades, most Americans consistently believed crime was increasing. But FBI stats showed a nearly 50% decrease in violent crime between 1990 and 2020.
50% decrease, but people thought it was going up.
Exactly. It highlights how consuming news, especially with terms like crime wave being thrown around, can drive cynical and often just plain wrong perceptions.
It's like we're constantly being told things are awful, even when the data says otherwise. And the material also mentioned deficit framing in media, how that contributes.
Right, deficit framing. That's when media portrays individuals or communities mainly through their problems, their shortcomings, often depicting vulnerable groups as helpless victims.
Which isn't helpful.
Well, while acknowledging challenge is important, this framing can reinforce negative stereotypes, make it easier to dismiss people. The research contrasts this with asset framing.
Asset framing.
Yeah, focusing on people's strengths, their agency, their goals, even when they're facing tough times. Shifting the narrative to highlight resilience can foster a more hopeful, less cynical view.
Okay, this paints a somewhat troubling picture. Our biases, society, media, all potentially pushing us towards cynicism. But one of our key sources offers hope for cynics. So let's explore some strategies. The idea of hopeful skepticism sounds like a good starting point.
It is. Hopeful skepticism is about finding that middle ground. You maintain a positive outlook, a belief in positive change. But you still engage in critical thinking. You evaluate information carefully. It's not about being naive, it's about being open to positive possibilities while staying grounded.
And practically, how can we actually cultivate this? The research suggests things like balancing your media diet.
Exactly. Given how prevalent negativity bias is, we need to be mindful of what we're consuming, actively seeking out asset-framed stories.
Like using the Solutions Story Tracker?
Yes. Resources like that, which focus on positive developments and effective solutions, can help counteract the constant stream of bad news. It's about consciously balancing your information intake.
The material also shared an interesting anecdote about Boston firefighters, how preemptive mistrust backfired.
Oh yeah, that's a telling example. The fire chief put in these really strict measures to prevent perceived sick leave abuse, basically operating from suspicion.
And
the unintended consequence was the firefighters, feeling untrusted, actually started taking more sick days. It really shows how cynicism can create these self-fulfilling prophecies.
where expecting the worst actually brings it about.
Precisely.
It highlights how trust, rather than being weak, can actually be a strength, like with that FBI agent, Robin Dreek.
Yes, Robin Dreek. Instead of manipulation or cynical tactics, he focused on building genuine trust with the people he needed intel from.
How do you do that?
By showing empathy, trying to understand their needs, he built long-term relationships that yielded valuable information. It really underscores that trust can be way more effective than suspicion.
And then there's Axelrod's tit-for-tat strategy from that virtual tournament. That also points to a more positive approach, right?
Axelrod's strategy, yeah. It did surprisingly well. It basically emphasizes being nice, start by cooperating, and then just mirror what the other person does. Reciprocity.
So not a pushover, but willing to cooperate first.
Exactly. If they cooperate, you cooperate. If they act selfishly, you do too next time. It showed that a generally cooperative, forgiving strategy, but with clear boundaries, could be very successful, especially in ongoing relationships. Trust yields the most benefit long term.
It seems our underlying beliefs about trust also play a huge role. The research mentioned fixed versus reciprocity mindsets.
Right. The key difference is your fundamental assumption. Do you believe trust is fixed? Some people have it, some don't. Or do you see it as something that can be fostered, reciprocated?
And what difference does that make?
Well, research suggests if we have a fixed mindset, we tend to dwell on past betrayals. But if we cultivate a reciprocity mindset, understanding people are more likely to be trustworthy when they feel trusted, it can actually encourage trustworthy behavior in others.
So our belief can actually shape their actions.
In a way, yes. Our own beliefs about others' capacity for trustworthiness can influence things.
The story of that rugby coach, Boyver, and his underbearing attentiveness seems like another great example of fostering trust.
Boyvert's style was really unique. Instead of constant direction, he created game-like scenarios and just let the players figure things out. Underbearing attentiveness.
So he trusted them to learn.
Deeply. It communicated this huge level of trust in their abilities. Even after losses, he kept believing in them. And that empowered the players, fostered self-reliance.
And led to success.
Remarkable success, yeah. Exceeding expectations. His approach really highlights how trusting others can unlock their potential.
It's interesting how often cynicism seems connected to feeling isolated. The research touches on the link between cynicism and loneliness.
Yes, it can be a bit of a vicious cycle, can't it? If you're always suspicious, you might not reach out, leading to isolation.
And being lonely might make you more cynical.
Exactly. Feeling disconnected can breed cynicism about whether anyone really cares. Our sources talk about social shark attacks.
Social shark attacks, what are those?
These exaggerated fears we have about social interactions, fears that stop us from connecting. Often, the reality of engaging with people is way more positive than our cynical predictions.
Like that experiment with commuters talking to strangers.
Beautifully illustrates it, yes. People expected it to be awkward, but generally found it surprisingly pleasant.
It's like we build these mental walls out of fear and cynicism that stop us having positive connections that are often right there.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to things like burnout, especially in helping professions, cultivating compassion seems more effective against cynicism than even self-care.
That's a really insightful finding. Self-care is vital, obviously, for exhaustion and stress. But research in healthcare settings showed that actively cultivating compassion towards others was actually more effective at reducing cynicism. Helping others can renew our sense of purpose in a way just focusing inward might not.
The research also mentioned social prescribing as a way to combat loneliness.
Exactly. Recognizing the huge impact of social connection on health, initiatives like social prescribing link people with local community groups, activities based on their interests.
Does it work?
Early evidence suggests it can increase connection, meaning well-being.
Yeah.
Even reduce the need for traditional medical services.
And even brief, everyday interactions can help, like the encounter counting experiment.
Yes, the simple act of intentionally having short social interactions, just exchanging a few words with a stranger, can have a cumulative positive effect on mood and connection. The experiment showed these encounters are often way more pleasant than we expect.
The story of artist Atsushi Watanabe using his experience with hikikomori, that really highlights how helping others can be healing, right? Connecting to mutual aid.
Watanabe's journey is incredibly powerful. From extreme isolation to using his art to voice others' experiences, he found that focusing on helping others gave him immense healing and purpose.
And that ties into mutual aid.
Yeah, the idea that cooperation and reciprocal support within communities are essential. It challenges that purely competitive view of human nature.
It's not just individuals, though. Organizations can be deeply affected by cynicism, too. The research used Microsoft under Ballmer as an example.
That's right. The work environment there was marked by internal competition, lack of trust, a very top-down approach. Policies like rank and yank.
Rank and yank.
Yeah, constantly evaluating employees against each other. It created this climate of fear, undermined collaboration. That organizational cynicism really stifled morale and new ideas.
And the shift under Satya Nadella, focusing on trust and support, shows the positive impact of moving away from that.
Definitely. The change in leadership brought a huge cultural transformation, prioritizing trust, empowering employees, offering support. The company saw a resurgence in morale and innovation. It clearly shows a trust-based environment works better than one driven by cynicism and control.
Turning back to the broader societal level, the research addresses political polarization, how we often overestimate how much the other side dislikes us or supports violence.
Yes, this overestimation is a big driver of polarization. We create these distorted pictures of our political rivals, imagining them as way more extreme and hostile than they mostly are.
The devil we don't know mentality.
Exactly. It fuels preemptive hostility, makes constructive dialogue almost impossible. Research consistently shows that while animosity exists, the actual level of dislike and support for violence is often much lower than we perceive.
The story of Andres Casas's work in Colombia trying to build peace, that highlighted the limits of just doing research in conflict zones, didn't it? The need for connection.
Casas' experience really underscores that. In deeply divided societies, traditional academic approaches aren't enough. Building trust and hope needs genuine human connection, using media to counter fear-mongering. His work, in Emil's meeting with that former soldier,
Yeah.
they powerfully demonstrate the potential of empathy and dialogue to bridge deep divides.
The research also offered some key ingredients for good disagreement: perspective taking, intellectual humility.
And valuing learning over just being right.
Yeah.
Yes, these are crucial antidotes to cynical, unproductive conflict.
Okay.
Being willing to see the other side, perspective taking, admitting we don't know everything, intellectual humility, and focusing on understanding rather than winning. That can transform conflict into learning, instead of just a downward spiral.
It's easy to feel like things are always getting worse, but the research reminds us of historical upswings in trust and progress. Positive change is possible.
That's such an important perspective. There have been periods where trust and social cohesion were stronger. Remembering these upswings offers hope. It reminds us the current climate isn't permanent. Hopeful work has driven change before.
And cynical narratives can do real harm. The debunking of the welfare queen myth is a powerful example.
Absolutely. That myth, largely unfounded, hugely impacted public opinion and policy, led to cuts in welfare, reinforced negative stereotypes about the poor, shows the damage of cynical narratives detached from reality.
And this connects to the idea of a constitution for knaves, how cynical treatment hits marginalized groups hardest. William Goodwin's story really illustrated that.
The Constitution for Knaves. Building a system assuming everyone's selfish and untrustworthy leads to restrictive, punitive measures. Goodwin's experience trying to get disability benefits highlights how this systemic mistrust crushes marginalized individuals already facing disadvantages, a system designed to doubt.
And this contrasts sharply with the trust for the few, cynicism for the many phenomenon, where the well-off get benefits easily, but the poor face suspicion.
Exactly, a noticeable double standard. Public benefits for the affluent mortgage tax breaks, college savings plans widely accepted, aid for lower incomes, often met with suspicion, stringent requirements. It reflects this tendency to trust those with more, be cynical towards those with less.
But Up Together offers a compelling alternative, right? Direct cash transfers based on trust.
Yes, Up Together's model is founded on trusting people in poverty to make the best decisions. Direct cash, no burdensome restrictions. It empowers people.
And the results.
Significant positive outcomes. Increased income, less reliance on traditional aid, better grades for kids. It directly challenges the cynicism surrounding aid for the poor.
Even looking back at historical top tax rates in the U.S., it reminds us that different approaches to wealth distribution have existed.
Right. History shows periods with significantly higher taxes on top earners, reflecting a different societal understanding of shared responsibility. Challenges the idea that the current landscape is the only way.
Loretta Ross's concept of calling in instead of calling out. That sounds like a more inclusive approach to change.
Calling in, yes. Engaging with people whose actions are problematic, but in a way that encourages dialogue and growth, not public shaming.
Based on a belief, they can change.
Exactly. It operates from the belief people can learn and evolve. Aims to broaden movements by creating space, unlike the often alienating effects of calling out,
Finally, the research tackled doomerism about climate change, how we often underestimate public support for action.
Yeah, that feeling of hopelessness that is too late, it can be paralyzing. But this doomerism often underestimates the significant public support for environmental policies and overlooks real progress in renewables and other solutions.
So maintain hopeful skepticism there too.
Exactly. Recognize collective action can still make a huge positive difference.
And this connects back to Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons versus Eleanor Ostrom's work.
Right. Hardin's cynical view that shared resources are doomed. But Ostrom's research showed countless real-world examples of communities successfully managing resources through cooperation and self-governance.
Challenging the purely self-interested view.
Yes, and philosophies like Ubuntu, emphasizing interconnectedness, community well-being, further challenge that narrow view.
It really all comes back to this fundamental question of human nature, our capacity for connection, cooperation. And that personal story about Emil's unwavering belief, that's a powerful note to end on.
Emil's life and work truly embodied that deep belief in human potential for connection, kindness, cooperation, even facing immense difficulty. His dedication to understanding and fostering peace reminds us of the hope that exists beyond cynicism.
So to kind of wrap up the key insights from this deep dive, cynicism, while it feels pervasive sometimes, is often rooted in misunderstandings, fueled by societal factors, negative biases in our information diet.
And it has real negative consequences for us as individuals and for society.
But as we've seen, we can cultivate what the research calls hopeful skepticism, being discerning, realistic, but without just giving in to cynicism.
And there are concrete steps you can take. That advice to balance your media diet is essential. Make a conscious effort to seek out those asset-framed stories highlighting solutions.
Use resources like the Solutions Story Tracker.
Exactly, to get a more complete, less cynical view of the world around us.
Finally, maybe take a moment to consider how your own levels of trust and cynicism might be influencing your perceptions, your actions. What small steps could you take to question any overly cynical assumptions you might hold?
Maybe even reflect on those 3 statements from the Cook and Medley test we talked about earlier. See how they resonate in your own life.
And remember, Emil's unwavering belief in our fundamental capacity for connection and kindness. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That even in a world that can feel cynical, the potential for hope and cooperation is still very much alive.